Sure. Thanks everybody for joining us again. Hopefully that won't happen now. I don't want to repeat everything that I just said and respect you all's time, but I did just want to reiterate how grateful we are for having all the authors come back and talk about their work, as well as all the resident editors from last year and the ones that are joining us this year. Hopefully we can have an even bigger and better spring journal, regardless of how things go in the spring semester. And I'm sorry, that is my dog whining behind me. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it back to Erin, who will moderate today's panel.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. I'm so sorry about that. I guess next time we know, always put a password. All right, cool. So opening up the author panel, I'd just like to go through and have everyone just briefly introduce yourself and your piece. And we will start with Caroline and her piece on Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact, coordinating climate change response through new government structures.
Yeah, hey everybody. My name's Caroline Nickerson. I graduated in the spring semester, so it's really great to be back virtually with you all. I really miss AU, and I was super excited about this new journal. My piece is about financing climate change and resiliency programs. And I'm sure I'll get more into it as we go through the questions and talk about our findings, but I came into the piece trying to think about how do we export this very successful model from South Florida to the rest of the country, because no one is exempt from the ramifications of climate change. The impacts may be different at a local and local level, but we're all going to have to do something. And I look forward to sharing my findings and analysis with you all.
Awesome, thank you very much. All right, next up we have Daniel Mullen with Colonial Political Thought and Independence.
I wrote this piece in spring 2019 for my American Political Thought class. I got my master's in political science, American politics, just graduated in December. It was a fun piece. It was my term paper. For me, when we were going through the class, we talked a lot about the concepts that have kind of shaped and guided the development of American political thought through history, right? So I wanted to kind of explore some of the antecedents of the not just the social norms, but the legal and constitutional framework for our quasi-republic, what has become a liberal modern democracy. And what I found was that oftentimes, and I'm sure my fellow authors have seen this too, not many things are mutually exclusive, but it's a complicated puzzle, if you will, of different parts that seem sometimes to a modern eye conflicting or contradictory, but really they're values that are complementary and different sides of problems that societies have been trying to solve for quite some time, whether it's equality versus freedom, democracy versus diversity, majority rule versus minority rights. Going through time and looking at some of the foundations of our rights and where they came from in our British past was really the goal, and doing this by looking at some historical documents is what I wanted to do, and that's that.
Awesome, thank you very much. Next up we have April Hurry and Megan Ballard with Great Streets Small Business Grant Programs, Criminological Effects in Washington, D.C.'s Emerging Corridors. So you can go in whichever order you guys would like.
Awesome. Well, thanks for creating this space. I was a bit bummed when the event had to be canceled, but I'm really glad that we all have the opportunity to be here. So hi everybody, I'm Megan. I actually graduated in December 2018 with an MS in Justice Law and Criminology with a public policy focus. April and I actually met in the advanced quantitative policy class, and that's where we wrote this paper together. I'm just going to kind of introduce a little bit what the meat of the paper is, and then April's going to expand a little bit on the methodology. But generally what we were looking at is this Great Streets program, and the Great Streets program is a grant program from the city of DC that gives revitalization funds to small businesses that are in specific corridors. And they're anything from like $500 for like an awning, something like that. And I'm sure now they're probably supporting, some outdoor seating area. We wanted to see how this program might influence crime in these particular areas, mainly because of my interest in criminological theory and April's interest in justice and urban policy. In general, we ended up using a criminological theory framework to kind of understand this research, to situate it. And what we found was quite interesting, and April and I can talk about that more. But in overarching kind of like theoretic finding was that there are these broad crime theories that say that crime should increase as neighborhoods change, or crime should decrease as neighborhoods change, as more money pours into neighborhoods, which is questionable to begin with, but that's just kind of what criminological theory tells you. But what we found is kind of the opposite, is that when you have an affluent presence, that reported crime might increase. And that kind of comes from this social control critique that richer people are going to feed into this normative idea of policing, that they're going to use police officers as a form to feel safe. So as affluent folks move into a neighborhood, we actually might see an increase in reported crime. So that was kind of the theoretic framework we were working with. And April will talk about this kind of innovative approach that we took when thinking about how to capture this data.
And hi, I'm April Hurry. I graduated last December with an MPP with an environmental focus. I'm also very interested in urban policy, and Megan and I worked to make sure our paper, fit both of our interests, and I think we got very lucky with that. One of the innovative things we did with our paper was using this innovative geospatial modeling technique. We took demographic data and grant and crime data from Open Data DC. We used ArcMap to create treatment and control areas rather than groups. So our treatment area was a circle with each business as the center of the circle. Our control area was then kind of a concentric circle around that, or like a donut around the treatment area. And we set both of them to have the same square footage, so we could directly compare crime counts within each area. Then we used this difference and differences analysis to see if crime changed immediately around the improved business, kind of relative to what may be happening a half a block away from the improvements. And so, our results suggested, it depends on the demographic makeup of the neighborhood and kind of socioeconomic changes that are going on through the time period of the neighborhood.
Awesome, thank you very much. And our last but not least is Dakota Strode with Public Policy Process and Don't Ask, Don't Tell.
Hey y'all, I'm Dakota. I was an MA student in the political science program with a focus on applied politics, but I'm currently a PhD student in the government department. So it's been an exciting first year. This piece was written in Wallner's class on public policy process. It's more of a descriptive paper in nature. It has basically, I built on Kingdon's public policy process model that's widely used in legislative studies to discuss the advancement and influences on legislation. I particularly look at Don't Ask, Don't Tell to see where the public became most involved in the process at, and that consequently was the first two stages, not the last two stages, where the public is more involved in the media, more involved with lobbying groups, more involved with contacting members, than in the latter stages where the policy is implemented and reevaluated.
Awesome, thank you all very much. All right, our next question is, what was the writing and editing process like? Do you have any tips or words of wisdom for those looking to submit their pieces in the future? And for this, let's start with Caroline again.
Yeah, oh my gosh, I was thinking about this question this morning. So I also, like many of the other folks on the panel, adapted a paper I wrote for a course into an article. And my big tip is when you're writing for a course, sometimes it's a little different than when you're initiating someone who might not be familiar with what you learned in the course, or the audience is just different. You're not just writing for your professor anymore, you're writing for a reading public. So when you make revisions, I would keep that in mind, and keep in mind that you're writing to be read. and your writing to be understood. So I really appreciated Carly, Carly Nalon, who was my editor extraordinaire. I think she helped me make it a little bit more general and a little less specific. I read it out loud to myself before I submitted it, just because even when you're writing academically and even when you're writing for a research-based audience, you want it to be something that's like enjoyable for people to read. And like, if you read it out loud and it sounds good to you, then it's probably a good thing to submit. So in terms of practical advice, read it out loud to yourself before you send it in.
That's great advice. Thank you very much. Next up, we'll have Daniel.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I mean, I was benefited by having a great editor. And I'm not just saying that. Sandra was my editor, and she really helped me through the process. This was the first time I had a piece go to publishing, and she was quite helpful. But yeah, I think your point is well taken too. Reading out loud so you can actually kind of hear how it flows and goes together. I often reminded myself to be as clear and concise as possible. In the first few sentences, first paragraph, the reader should know what I'm saying or what I'm trying to say. And not just to bring them in, but to provide some information that might be helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. All right, April and Megan, what would you like to say?
So I'll go first. I think I agree with Caroline's point to target to your audience. I know there were a lot of things we ended up taking out of our paper that was really class specific and maybe didn't lead to the final conclusions. We're just kind of reporting of our process of how we did the paper. And for the published one, we wanted it to just, flow more easily from what we found, and just highlight our main findings.
Yeah, and as long as we're shouting out editors, we also had Carly, and she was great as well for helping us think through those issues. And the only other thing I would say is don't be afraid to co-author. I think it was a really great experience for April and I to work together. April and I kind of joke that we both have very different strengths, and in many ways we complemented each other because of that. And overall, our paper became stronger because of that. So if you're nervous about, submitting to PPJ, but you want to consider co-authoring.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you very much. All right, Dakota.
I think the best piece of writing advice I can give is something I got this year, was to not take myself so seriously when doing it. I think a lot of the time in graduate courses and any sort of task that'll make you want to write or edit or make sure someone sees it is to try to make it as clean and perfect as possible, which is always great, but can sometimes be too stressful and not necessarily the point of the writing process. And so just in general, I would say everything will be okay. There's some things that matter more and that come along later in the editing process than the first draft submitted.
Absolutely. All right, cool. So our next question is, how did your piece fit into the journal theme, paradoxes, paradigms, and justice? And how did you interpret this theme? I promise we'll stop doing the direct down the line after this question. But for now, let's go with Caroline.
Yes. So of the 3 words, I think the one that resonated the most with my piece was paradigm. So I read about the Southeast Regional Climate Change Compact, Southeast Florida Regional. It's a big acronym, lots of letters. And I wanted to understand if this collaborative network in Southeast Florida would be something that other regions could also do to help adapt to climate change. And the way this network works is it's 4 counties and certain municipalities within those counties, people can opt in, and they basically share ideas and expertise with each other. And the reason why it came about was actually really interesting. Basically, county people went up to DC and they were all competing for federal money against each other. And to do that, they accidentally gave different figures for sea level rise projections, which is very embarrassing for them. So it was a recommendation after that trip that they all start working together, and that's how the Climate Change Compact was born. And it's interesting that an entity without any legal authority or any real formal status is so effective, because they donate in-kind staff time. They have like a nonprofit fiscal agent, and they're able to get a number of different foundation and federal grants. And they're able to basically just like at an informal level, from the interviews I did with different staff members, they can speak expert to expert about things they need advice on. So they don't have to reinvent the wheel for every type of like climate change mitigation strategy. So the reason I think the compact works so well down there is because there are very pressing problems in the southeast of Florida, and there are competent people willing to solve those problems who are eager to work together. And I thought that was a really interesting paradigm, a way of seeing this issue. You know, but in terms of like the paradigm of it, applying it elsewhere, my conclusion was I don't know if it necessarily would work somewhere else. It's a very unique situation where the problem is so visible, and there are other regional cooperative networks in the United States addressing different issues, not just climate change, but the one in Southeast Florida is the only one that's truly bipartisan. So my conclusion was it's great that something good is happening. They have a really interesting financial and administrative structure, but in terms of the paradigm of the thing, I wasn't sure if the model was exportable.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's a really great interpretation of a paradigm. Thank you so much for that. All right, Daniel, what would you say about your piece?
You know, I thought about this when I was going back and editing it, preparing it for the journal, and I think it was a mixture of paradigm and paradox. I think paradigm fit well because the rights that colonists talked about at the time of revolution were rights that they inherited as British settlers in America in the early 17th century. The Virginia and other charters established rights and privileges for settlers to basically set out and establish democratically governed in one way or another, and that obviously developed over the decades in the colonial era to develop economic and political rights. And from those economic rights, we saw a birth or greater political rights. Now, as the century went on and into the 17th century, we saw a parallel in Great Britain. Obviously, the United States was, or the New World was a part of Great Britain still, but and this wasn't just a burgeoning thing. It wasn't new. Britain had long been in Europe considered one of the best or more freer countries before the term democracy became popular. But particularly with the Glorious Revolution and more secure rights for Parliament to sort of govern along with the monarch, there's the science of Whig politics established in the 18th century and on, that really 17th and 18th century, that established one's rights to not just economic gain, but to certain privileges in society that allowed more freedoms. So again, when we discuss paradigm in American political development, I think going back and like I discussed earlier, tracking those antecedents, whether they're in historical documents, constitutions, I think is incredibly important. But I set out to do it because I think I wanted to capture some of the unspoken attitudes and norms that were prevalent at the time. So I could kind of pick a few variables to discuss in my paper and go from there. Obviously, I discussed something that was fairly obvious. Yeah, the colonists wanted to protect their economic rights, and it was a reaction to the British curtailing those rights that they had established for the colonists. But this really set off a chain of greater political development post-revolution that expanded our idea of a democratic society, what the world had seen at that point. So
PPJ, paradox, something.
Anyways, but that's kind of where I was going, and I concluded, there are practical and theoretical implications to documents in history, and oftentimes it just takes a little looking into the past to learn something about where your own ideas and the social norms that can guide them or determine them originated from.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for that. All right, up next we have April and Megan again.
Yeah, so I'll fill this one for the two of us. I think where our paper kind of falls in the topics is paradox and justice. I think justice being the more obvious one when you have a paper about crime, but for us, this is a paper that's not just about crime. It's about access to economic success. It's about what does economic success mean. It's about who's defining that. It's about where that money is flowing from city to community. So I think a lot of this was really to think about in the context, the outcome of crime, but really thinking about how programs work and how they effectuate change in particular communities and what kind of change that looks like. For paradox, I think one of the things that was interesting to me is somebody who now I'm actually in a PhD program at UC Irvine in criminology and very much critiquing theories like social disorganization theory because of their built-in assumptions about particular communities and in particular communities of color. As somebody who kind of looks at that, I'm looking back at this paper. I think what this paper does is it frustrates and it complicates whether or not these theories can even work in contemporary times. And when you throw in concepts like gentrification, which is in some ways people could argue that the Great Streets program tries to put money back into the community of community members that have lived in these corridors for a long time, but it also puts money into the pockets of business owners that are new to the area as well. And it kind of contributes to this idea of gentrification. And whatever your feelings are on gentrification, there are impacts and ramifications of gentrifications to neighborhoods. And I think those kind of concepts are really kind of frustrating these old criminological theories that have led our field for so long. And I think in that way, this paper has that paradox component, a theoretic paradox, and then justice as understood in the criminological way, but also understood in the economic and social way.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Dakota.
So I think how mine fits in to the themes of the journal was when, in general, in political science, when we think about the public policy process and what Kingdon has done in general, we don't typically apply that in the literature to specific groups. So when we think about how legislation is passed and the literature that discusses the public policy process, we don't typically normalize that with LGBTQ people and the legislation regarding their rights or against their rights. So I saw this as an opportunity to look at the normal process of how legislation is passed and then think about how that actually would apply to a particular case, that being Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And I think what the article, even though it's brief, does shed a bit of a light on where LGBTQ legislation might fit in and how the public might actually be involved in that process.
Absolutely. Thank you all guys. Thank you everyone for sharing those. It's cool to see how everyone interprets the theme and applies it to their own topics of interest. So it's very cool to see that. All right, great. So for the next couple questions, they may or may not apply to your piece. So feel free to just jump in if it does and if you would like to say something about it. And if everyone still has something to share, that's fantastic. So the next question is, if your topic relates to racial justice, can you please share your thoughts about how it's being shaped by current events?
I can jump in really quickly. My issue is, I think, really ripe for inequities, especially along racial lines. A lot of the research I did talked about the potential of like climate gentrification in the counties that are part of the compact. And there was one particular quote, I can find it, that I thought was really resonant. A researcher who has studied this extensively, the threats that climate change poses for Southeast Florida, said that there might be new resilient islands. And this is a pitfall with the compact as well, because it has no legal authority, right? And people can opt in. So certain municipalities don't participate because they just maybe don't have the bandwidth to do resiliency planning. So that could make it so a place like Miami Beach becomes a resilient island, and it has a bunch of infrastructure investments. It's very active in the compact. And then other areas that are more vulnerable and filled with more people who are at risk or underserved. The way a researcher described it was a climate slum. So it could be a place where people, like somewhere like Little Haiti in Southeast Florida, may gentrify, and people may be pushed out into areas that don't have as many infrastructure improvements. So that's, I think, a pitfall of an informal compact. When you have some level of formality, you can be more comprehensive and you can be more top down. When it's just different leadership opting in, what do you do about the people who don't have the leaders advocating for them?
Thank you, Caroline. Did any of the other authors want to comment on this question? If not, we can move to the next one.
Yeah, I think April and I's paper, this kind of touches, I think, on this question and the next question. We were kind of thinking, like, we don't explicitly grapple with racial justice in our paper, but so much of our paper touches on concepts of racial justice. And again, it kind of comes to this idea of where commerce flows, who gets money, who has access to money, who are the small business owners that are benefiting from grant programs like this. And I think in many ways, because we also did interviews of the grant givers as part of this project, and understanding what the purpose of the project was. And so I think our paper kind of touches on that, is like, who are the gatekeepers and who are the recipients of these grants, and what are the things that we should be prioritizing and thinking about. So in thinking about especially the events that have happened in the last year, which doesn't mean that none of this was obviously the undercurrent of forever, but these things coming to light, and I think being more politicized and cities feeling more pressure to really think about how their programs are uplifting their communities of color. I think that's what this project really tries to get at, which is better understanding how these projects are formed and how these projects impact communities.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. Thank you. If no one else has a comment, we can move on to our last question from the panel and then open it up to the audience. So our last question is, how could the topics in your piece be shaped by the 2020 election?
I can take a stab at this if everyone's okay with that. So I think when we talk about LGBTQ rights legislation and how it impacts the public policy process, or how people impact the public policy process, if we go back to when the Equality Act passed in the 116th Congress, there was substantial push by interest groups to mobilize support, not only among members of Congress, but at the local level. There was substantial media pushes. There were famous celebrities everywhere trying to help. And it was one of the largest pushes to get a bill passed in recent LGBTQ legislative history regarding sweeping legislation. So I think when we compare what happened in 2018 regarding the Equality Act with what will happen depending on who wins the next election, if it is Republican nominee who wins, it will probably still mirror the 2018 election, the process of mobilization. If the Democrat wins, it'll probably be a much more rapid process, not as slow as it was taking 2 years to actually try to get that bill moving along. But if one chamber is controlled than the other, it'll probably mirror what happened in the 116 Congress. But I think in general, because there's more push at the current moment for transgender rights, particularly with the Democratic Party and who is in control of the Democratic Party in the House, we might see LGBTQ legislation having more gender identity components in it, making it more challenging to get sponsors that are not Democrats on bills, and challenging to push that through the public policy process model using public opinion, who is only now growing more supportive of those rights.
I can jump in. I think for the compact in Southeast Florida, I mean, many of the grants they're applying for are federal grants. So with the 2020 election, I mean, how the executive branch changes, like how the makeup of like Congress changes, that's going to be huge for, like, they've gotten like very substantial NOAA grants in the past, NOAA. So, and depending on how it goes as well, I know that with this administration, there are certain states it works with more than others. So if Florida goes blue, and like, you know, there are different relationships between like the executive branch and the state government and like different regions in the state. I mean, especially with something like the Southeast, this compact, because the structure is so informal and they get funding from so many different sources. There are definitely ramifications, I think, and changes in strategy depending on how the election goes.
And for our paper, we identified two things that are relevant to the current events. One has to do with the election. Depending on how that goes, it's possible cities and urban areas could have funding cut to them, and not just DC, but other cities too. So programs like this that give small grants to small businesses may have trouble surviving. And I think our second current topic has to do with the awareness that the protests over the summer had in how people report crime. It's possible people become more aware of the effects of reporting minor crimes and are more cautious now to bring the police in to something that maybe really isn't, you know, a very serious situation.
I just had another quick thought, if you let me jump in again. I thought about one thing we learned in financing government services is like the difference between like a state level program and like a federal program, and like all the different, you know, ramifications thereof. And about there are different models of federalism, right? Like we have like our laboratories of democracy, and like the things kind of wax and wane in terms of like states taking more leadership, regions taking more leadership, and like the federal government taking more leadership. And I could see if there's 4 more years of the Trump administration, for example, there might be more of an impetus for states that wouldn't under a Biden administration to create regional compacts. Because if you're not seeing federal policies you want to see, especially on climate, you might feel compelled as like county leadership or municipality leadership to make things happen across regional boundaries. So I think that's one potential ramification of the election. I think there could be more or less regional compacts depending on the direction of federal policy.
Awesome. Thank you all. This is a great range of topics that we've covered, so I really appreciate all of you being willing to speak with us. Are there any questions from the audience? Feel free to put them in the chat or just unmute yourself. And you can direct them at a specific author if you like, or just ask the whole panel as a whole.
One for the authors. As a procrastinator myself, I want to know from you all, how would your projects have been different, or what other avenues would you have researched if you had had more time to write these? And, you know, if you had been writing it, like maybe not in grad school, and maybe like you had infinite time in the world, infinite resources to take this topic to the next level, what other avenues would you have explored?
Great question. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. For me, I've been thinking about this a lot as I've had a little bit of time to do some reading and whatnot when I'm not working. But I think I paid a lot of attention to commerce, economic rights or political rights as it pertains to economic rights, and that mode of causation, if you will. I think if I had more time now, I would discuss more of the Republican and Democratic traditions that transformed the country in 1770 to 1789, really, and focus a little bit more on post-revolutionary political thought as it relates to some of those principles, because I didn't pay enough attention to that for what I would really want for a larger paper, and obviously it's not just our economic or liberal foundations vis-a-vis Whig political thought versus Tory political thought, but really there are more classical or ancient notions of civic duty and republicanism, not in the big R but little r sense. So don't confuse that. So yeah, exploring that part, how civic duty and more individual notions of liberty enmesh, if you will, in our political tradition, how those contradict each other or rather complement each other. Those have been concepts that society has struggled with since the turn of the millennia, really. The idea of equality versus freedom and which rights have more value or less value. Oftentimes we look at the rulers, especially if we're going into the past, but as we gain greater traction as individuals and really grab hold to more and become more familiar with individual rights and liberalism in a classic sense, then I think there can be a greater appreciation for why the ancients, why our founding fathers devoted so much time to civic virtue, because it was out of concern for the individuals. And in that sense, I think that's where I would really like to take the work in the future, if that helps at all.
I would say for our paper, excuse me, our time limit had to do more with technical issues. We really liked this donut method we did where we got a control area that's maybe a half a block or so away from each business. But as it turned out, in some of the corridors, the businesses were so close to each other that one business's control area was another business's treatment area. And so really found that could have possibly had a negative effect on our data. And had we been able to have more time and look more closely into identifying other control businesses that were slightly further apart, but still within the same demographic areas, it could have been an interesting result to compare to what we did with the donut method.
I think for mine.
Thank you guys. So we have another. Oh, go ahead, Dakota.
I think for mine, the one thing I would want to do, I don't have time to do it, but would be to do a historical case study approach where I would be comparing Don't Ask, Don't Tell with the other major pieces of legislation that passed through the House. So Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and the Equality Act, the Do No Harm Act, these various things that are temporally spaced apart, but carry a lot of the same actors that advocated on all those and use a lot of the same strategies, because that social network of LGBT rights groups is very, they work together a lot on these issues to lobby. So that would be a longer, more drawn out analysis comparing each stage of the public policy process. And then I guess to answer the question in the chat, The hardest part of writing anything to me is making it short and concise, because I think all of us have subjects that we care about the most, and we want to tell you everything you could possibly learn in one setting. So to make it easy to read and digestible without any jargon and only in a couple pages is definitely more taxing than telling you everything I possibly know.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you all so much. There's only a few minutes left, so I'm going to turn it over to Arsene for some final comments. But seriously, thank you guys for your time, and thanks to everybody who came. I really appreciate getting to know you all and getting to talk to you all about your different policy interests and your pieces. So thank you very much. Arsene?
Yes, thank you so much, Aaron. And I would like to thank everyone for joining us. As the editor-in-chief, I am so fulfilled and extremely proud of how we were able to pull off our fall digital journal event, where our theme is Paradoxes, Paradigms, and Justice. We had a small mishap, but we made it work. There were many meetings, emails, and texts amongst our 2020-2021 staff to coordinate tasks, and the commitment itself is not taken for granted at all. So thank you so much to our entire 2020-2021 staff. Also, thank you to our 2019-2020 staff for laying the groundwork so we can have this event. We are extremely grateful for the relationship we have built and therefore support gained from our department, the School of Public Affairs. Thank you to our faculty advisor, Dean Jackenowitz, for support and years of service to the American University Public Purpose Graduate Journal. Thank you to our authors for submitting their pieces and attending our event. Special thanks to our guests who served on our panel. Thank you, and a huge shout out to Aaron, our managing print editor, as this event itself is hosted by Aaron. Moving forward, we invite the entire SPA graduate community to submit pieces for our online website. We also invite you to submit to our 2020-2021 print journal. You can submit to the following email, publicpurposejournal@gmail.com. Our theme for the print journal will be announced in the coming weeks. Lastly, we would like everyone to follow us on our social media sites. Instagram @PublicPurposeAU, Twitter @PublicPurposeAU, Facebook, The Public Purpose Journal. As you can find everything mentioned on our social media sites there as well. Again, thank you and good night.
Thank you all. Have a good night.